Howdy, I am Dr. Anna Maria Helt, herbalist and microbiologist here at osada.com, and what you can't see in the background are my four-legged assistants, Milo Gurley and Phyllis H. Dog. Today I'm going to talk about why you should consider eating garlic and using garlic in your life. The focus is actually going to be on garlic and viruses. And so as a researcher of pathogenic viruses for the better part of a decade, at that point I ate garlic simply because it tastes good and it's one of my favorite foods and spices, and yeah, I can stink as a result of it. It wasn't until I started training as a traditional herbalist some dozen or more years ago that I started thinking of garlic as anything other than something that tastes really good. Now, by garlic, botanically speaking, I'm referring to Allium sativum. Allium is the genus name. Many other members of that genus are also delicious, that things that are related to garlic. Sativum means cultivated. And so, indeed, this is a plant or a crop that has been cultivated for many, many centuries. And as medicine, garlic has thousands of years of history as medicine and as a spice. So, as an herbalist, it really is that tradition going back generation after generation after generation that informs how I use herbs and my choice of herbs for different situations in providing support for myself and others. As a research scientist, or a former research scientist, I also do like to do a critical read of the lab-based studies and the clinical-based studies on various medicinal herbs, including things like garlic. Now, I'm going to circle back to viral-related stuff. And the focus mainly is going to be on respiratory viruses since we're coming in to cold and flu season, at least here where I live in Colorado, and since we've also been dealing with a pandemic as well. Now, viral infections can be difficult to actually treat. And the reason for that is because viruses use our own cells to replicate. And I'm going to go through that in just a moment in a very high-tech way. But because they use our own cellular machinery with which to propagate themselves, it can make it hard to target that process with a drug without causing damage to our own cells, and hence toxicity of the drug. It's not impossible, but it is challenging. But before I move on, I want to just do a quickie, as I said, extremely high-tech overview of what I mean when I'm talking about viral infection and viral replication. Those of you in my small group of loyal followers know that I'm extremely high-tech with these videos. I'm being sarcastic there. So here we go. Here's this schematization of viral infection. So here on this side, we have some viruses here. Just randomly shaped viruses. The little spiky parts sticking out are how some viruses will stick to cells. This is what I call the face-off stage of virus meets cell. That's very much not a scientific term. Here is our target cell there, and the nucleus, which is kind of the command center of our cells. So we have face-off, and then we have kind of step one here called attachment, the attachment phase. This is where the viruses will stick to the surface of the cell, sometimes using projections off of the virus, binding to specific receptors or proteins and such on the cell surface. I'm simplifying this ridiculously, by the way, but just to give you a sense here. Then we have the entry stage where the viruses use various mechanisms to actually get inside of the cell. And then, hold on. There we go. Camera freaks out when I hold things up, so sorry about that. So we have the viruses now released inside of the cell where they can take over the cell's various bits of machinery, and this is where viral replication actually occurs. So the viruses encode with either DNA or RNA. In this case, this is an RNA virus, for making copies of themselves, and they use various parts of the cell to do this. So here are, various bits that the cell is being programmed to make. Then we have assembly here. This is when new progeny virions, or basically baby viruses, are being made. And then basically at the end we have egress or exit of the newly made viruses from the cell. Often the cell dies. Not always though, but often the cell will die here. And the next cell becomes infected. So those are the basic stages of a virus attaching to, getting into the cells, propagating itself, and leaving. Extremely simplified, kind of roughly based on the replication cycle of a so-called RNA virus. That may or may not have any meaning to you. Don't worry about it if it does not. So generally our immune system will respond to an acute viral infection by killing that cell. Poor cell. Or directly inhibiting different steps of virus infection, whether we're talking about getting into the cell, leaving the cell, or the many steps of replication or self-propagation within the cell. And I'm bringing that up for a reason that I'll come back to momentarily when I talk about garlic. So coming back to garlic and its use for respiratory infection, that goes back many centuries, that there's a history of that in various parts of the globe, from Asia, where many members of the Allium genus originated from, to Europe, to Africa, for instance. And of course, many of us here in North America use garlic for dealing with infections and such, self-support. My own favorite preparation is raw garlic and pesto. It's the only way I can get raw garlic to stay down. But I'll come back to the different forms of garlic as well. Now, as I said, I like to circle back and look at what research science has to say about different herbs and what they're doing. And so there is some preclinical data, quite a bit actually, looking at garlic and viruses. Now, preclinical studies are those studies that are done, say, in cultured cells, in a dish, or in animals. And these all need to be taken with a grain of salt because they don't necessarily reflect what happens in the real world in a person. But for instance, a study in cell culture can be a jumping off point where somebody notices something interesting that's worth studying and looking into. So what we know from preclinical data, like putting tradition aside, what we know from preclinical data in the lab is that garlic in various preparations thereof is capable of inhibiting multiple different viruses of widely different categories, everything from influenza to the multiple cold viruses, including the various coronaviruses that are a cause of the common cold. Garlic has been found in culture to inhibit the virus causing SARS, so coronavirus, there goes my brain, the coronavirus that was responsible for that initial SARS epidemic that happened a number of years ago. And I say initial because the current COVID-19 epidemic is from a closely related virus to that original one. That also causes a severe acute respiratory syndrome, which is what SARS stands for. Anyway, garlic also inhibits measles virus, HIV, cytomegalovirus, which is a type of herpes virus. And speaking of herpes viruses, garlic can inhibit HSV itself, herpes simplex virus, the cause of cold sores and genital lesions. Various components of garlic can inhibit neurotropic viruses. Neurotropic is a fancy word for saying viruses that infect the nervous system. Herpes is one of those, but other viruses such as Coxsackie virus and echoviruses target the nervous system, nerve cells. Enteric viruses, viruses that infect the gastrointestinal system and make you crap your brains out, things like rotaviruses, as an example, are also inhibited by garlic. A virus that I studied as a postdoctoral fellow, dengue virus, is also inhibited in preclinical studies by various types of garlic. Hepatitis A virus, which is a foodborne virus, cause of food poisoning, was also inhibited by garlic. So just a wide range of viruses that are, DNA viruses, meaning that virus's genetic material is DNA. RNA viruses like dengue, which means the virus's genetic material is RNA. Very different lifestyle than DNA viruses. Enveloped viruses like influenza, where they have a membrane on the outside, are inhibited. Non-enveloped viruses, that lack a membrane on the outside are also inhibited. So very broad spectrum, as it were. Now, preclinical studies point to, in part, immune-mediated mechanisms that garlic is inducing to somehow inhibit garlic propagation, virus propagation in the cells or in the body. And also there is information pointing to direct antiviral effects. And this is what's really interesting to me. Direct antiviral effects of garlic on different stages of viral infection and replication, depending on the virus. So if we look back at our poor little cell here, garlic and some of its components have been found to, to inhibit the ability of the virus to attach to the cell and or to actually get into the cell. So the cell doesn't even wind up getting infected. Other studies, here we go, high tech, show that different parts of garlic or garlic extract itself, depending on the virus, may inhibit various steps of the replication that the virus undergoes in the cell. There's even some studies showing that garlic may inhibit egress or exit of a particular virus from the cell, depending on the virus. So getting into some specific examples, flu, like H1N1 type of flu that you may have heard of being studied in cultured cells, when treated with garlic, does not get into the cell. So the garlic, certain components of the garlic are sticking to flu and preventing it from interacting with the stuff on the cell that is required for the virus to get into the cell. And there are other mechanisms that may be going on here that are preventing entry of the virus in the cell due to garlic. And then for some other viruses that have an envelope on the outside, kind of like flu does, this membrane, that membrane gets completely destroyed by garlic. And that membrane is actually important for the virus to get into the cell. For SARS, coronavirus version 1, the cause of the SARS epidemic a number of years ago, it was found in culture-based data that garlic inhibited not only the sticking of the virus to the cell, but its ability or its end stages of replication within the cell. And then as another example, coming back to flu, H1N1, there's some studies showing that even if the virus gets into the cell, that different parts of garlic or different chemicals from garlic are able to inhibit the synthesis of components of influenza virus, meaning that some parts of the virus, their production in the cell is being blocked. Now, again, a lot of these studies were done in cultured cells. Some of them were done in animals. It's important to look at them with a grain of salt. Regardless, especially the data on respiratory viruses, this really does strongly back up the centuries and centuries and centuries of empirical data and experience of people using garlic to help prevent or deal with unwanted respiratory crud. Now, moving on into clinical data. So now we're talking about, at least what I'm focusing on, are controlled clinical trials. Now, these aren't necessarily enormous trials. They range anywhere from several dozen people to maybe 500 people, but at least are controlled studies and enough of them finding a positive benefit in a controlled manner of studying this. So there was a, quote, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Double-blind means during the trial, nobody, the scientists or the subjects, the patients, know who's getting the placebo or control stuff and the garlic preparation. And so this was a study, pretty old now, done in 2001, that found significant protection against getting the common cold when using garlic. That was not seen when using placebo. Another randomized controlled trial, where randomized means that specific subjects were not selected to receive placebo versus treatment. It was randomized who received placebo versus treatment. Anyway, this was in close to 500 children, I believe, and some other interesting controls were done during this study that I'm not going to get into, but this study is from 2003, and it was found that illness due to various types of viruses that cause acute respiratory diseases, illness due to that was down by about 2 to 4-fold compared to placebo. So morbidity, symptoms, illness was significantly reduced. And then another controlled, randomized controlled trial, a placebo trial. This one was with aged garlic extract, reduced severe cold and flu symptoms, reduced the days of sickness with cold or flu, and the days of school missed in terms of young folks that were in the study. And so various components of the immune system appeared to be involved under the influence of garlic. So for instance, natural killer cells that are components of our innate immune system, our first responder group. Gamma delta T cells, another type of cell in our immune system that helps protect us. And then finally, there was an interesting study where they used a powdered formulation mixed with cellulose that was used intranasally. So to me, the idea of sticking any kind of preparation of garlic up my nose is questionable because it's kind of harsh. Presumably they accounted for that in the preparation of this stuff that they used, but what they found in this controlled study is that people that use this stuff up their nostril a certain number of times a day had a significantly reduced incidence of infection compared to those who use the control. So there was, this implies that there was reduced chance of picking up airborne infections. In terms of other viruses, clinically speaking, in terms of actual studies in humans, garlic has been found to help with human papillomavirus-induced lesions, in other words, genital warts, which is what my doctorate was on, HPV and cancer. Now, genital warts are not cancerous, but HPV can cause various cancers as well, different types of HPV. But anyway, this study was specifically done with the so-called benign types of human papillomavirus, or HPV, that causes warts. So there was benefits in terms of resolving the wart in those people. Now, the virus is usually long gone by the time that wart is fully formed, but it does leave behind a couple of its viral proteins that stimulate unwanted cell growth, hence the wart forming. So it suggests that garlic is having some influence to counter those viral genes encoding for viral proteins that are kind of left behind by this hit and run HPV infection. And then there's been some clinical study in people with viral induced hepatitis showing better outcome with garlic preparations than with placebo. And I'm not getting into all the various garlic preparations that have been used in these studies. And in multiple studies, administration of garlic in various forms has been found to enhance the immune system response in virus-infected people. Now, what's going on with garlic? Its chemistry is pretty interesting. It contains at least 30 different compounds or molecules that contains sulfur in them. Now, sulfur is the reason why garlic is stinky, and it's the reason why you might become stinky if, like me, you tend to eat a lot of garlic. And so these organic sulfur compounds, or OSCs, are a significant part of the medicinal activities of garlic, especially as it pertains to viral infection. But there are many other categories of molecules in garlic that are also a part of this, either directly in and of themselves or by having some kind of conjunctive function that they do together with those sulfur compounds. Now, the chemistry of garlic changes depending on how you prepare it and how you handle it, whether it's dried or cooked or raw. And the studies that I cited in people did use a whole range of garlic preparations with, somewhat differing chemistry, and all of them had beneficial effects. Now, as an herbalist, traditionally speaking, we use raw garlic preparations to try to go for more direct support in terms of viral infection, as well as immune-related support. But we're often trained that garlic powder and cooked garlic won't have those direct effects necessarily, but will have more immune-supporting effects. But when you look at the research data, it suggests that, again, different types of garlic may have direct effects against viruses. But in my experience, I do find raw garlic in my own hands to be the most supportive if I feel like crap, if I feel like I've got the crud. And it's not a substitute for seeking out proper medical treatment for whatever you've got going on, but depending on what's going on, it can sure be helpful. And then at least you'll stink enough that nobody wants to get near enough to you so that they'll transmit an infection. So I think I will leave it at that, garlic and viruses. I'll probably circle back around and talk, a little bit more about garlic and other types of viruses beyond respiratory viruses, because viruses in general are interesting. Anyway, there you go. Thanks for listening.